Good evening, dear Grolier colleagues and distinguished guests. I am Bruce Crawford, cheerfully past president of the Grolier Club. I chose that word very carefully. And it is my great privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, David Allen Richards. Dave is a retired Manhattan real estate lawyer and was counsel to the Grolier Club for the important landmark sale of its air rights in 2006. He is a graduate of Yale College, the University of Cambridge, and Yale Law School. Dave's collection of the first editions and manuscripts of Rudyard Kipling, the largest in the world, is now at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. I am proud to count Dave among my closest friends here at the Grolier Club. His bibliography of Kipling, co-published in 2010 by Oak Knoll Press and the British Library, and the subject of the third Breslauer Lecture delivered in this club, has been described by our former president, Tom Tansell, as one of the landmarks of 20th century descriptive author bibliography, and is now cited by all major auction houses and rare book dealers listing Kipling titles. This summer, Oak Knoll Press will bring out Dave's latest book, titled, I Give These Books, The History of the Yale University Library, 1656 to 2016. He presently serves as the president of the Yale Library Associates and was elected last year to be the president of the Kipling Society, the first non-Brit ever to serve in that office. In that post, he now outranks T.S. Eliot, who was a vice president of the Kipling Society. Over the years, as a member and longtime distinguished counselor of this club, Dave has spoken to us many times. Many of you will have read his article on the book collector's odyssey in the latest issue of the Grolier Gazette, and he spoke to us by Zoom at the beginning of the COVID pandemic with Mark Samuels-Lasner on the book plates designed by Rudyard Kipling, his father John Lockwood Kipling, and his uncle Edward Burne-Jones. Dave's topic tonight, like his talk to the club in 2017 about the Yale Secret Society Skull and Bones and its influence on American writers such as William Faulkner, Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and John O'Hara, is another cross-cultural journey. This one about Kipling's Kim, The Great Game, and Real Spies. Kipling's 1901 novel introduced the reading public to the romance of international spycraft, while also influencing later authors of the genre and actual spies. Kim concerns the Great Game, the contest of Britain and Russia for the control of the Indian subcontinent. The plot centers on the training of an Anglo-Irish orphan, Kimball O'Hara, recruited to the Secret Service of the Raj to help expel foreign agents, stirring up trouble on the northwest frontier. But was that spy network real, with its agent numbers like C-25, or fictional? And what impact did the story have on actual spies, such as the Cambridge spy ring Kim Philby, spy rings Kim Philby, and the CIA's Alan Dulles and Edward Lansdale, the man thought to be Graham Greene's model in The Quiet American, and Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Kim Roosevelt? And how did Kipling's novel influence his literary successors in the genre, like John Buchan, the author of Greenmantle, Ian Fleming, author of the Bond novels, and our greatest contemporary spy novelist, the late John le Carré? Answers to come. Please join me now in welcoming to the podium my dear friend, David Allen Richards.
It was Kipling who introduced the reading public to the romance of the international spy, a character which became a hero of 20th century popular literature and film. His great novel of 1901, Kim, is a narrative both of spiritual quest, in which Teshu Lama, the Tibetan monk, goes in search of a river where the Buddha's arrow has landed, and of international intrigue in the playing of the great game, a term Kipling's book made current, between Great Britain and Russia for the control of the Indian subcontinent. The boy Kim learns to spy for the British while on that journey as chela, or disciple, to the holy man. These are the main characters in Kim. We don't have to review the novel for you to, I hope, understand and enjoy what I'm about to say. The author himself called it nakedly picaresque and plotless, a thing imposed from without, meaning it was an episodic narrative of the road, like Cervantes' Don Quixote. The narrative recounts the wanderings of the Anglo-Irish Indian orphan, Kimball O'Hara, or Kim, on his sudden choice to accompany a lama on a religious quest, which leads, through Kim's friendship with the native horse trader Mahbub Ali, working for the British spy master Colonel Creighton, to the pursuit and final expulsion of two foreign agents, a Russian and a Frenchman, disguised as hunters, trying to stir up trouble in the northwest frontier region. Through Mahbub, Kim is introduced to the Bengali Babu, an agent for the British, Hurry Chunder Mukherjee, who's disguised as a surveyor to give cover for his travels near that contested frontier. The Babu describes to Kim the foreign spies' effectiveness at sowing rebellion among the border tribes. Quote, "They make promises. They speak as the mouthpiece of a Kaiser with gifts. They make the five kings to believe that a great army will sweep the passes tomorrow or the next day. You think no one dare conspire. That is all Tommy rot." Close quote. This is a map of the Punjab with the neighboring mountain ranges. A quarter century before publishing Kim in 1901, the 16-and-a-half-year-old Kipling, no doubt influenced by his parents' letters from northwest India — he was at a grammar school in England — had proposed at a school debate at United Services College that the, quote, "advance of Russia in Central Asia is hostile to British power." And he carried his motion by 21 votes to 9. The alarm he raised about Russia as a schoolboy had not been put aside by 1885, when for his newspaper, the Civil and Military Gazette, he covered the negotiations of the Viceroy, Lord Dufferin, with the Emir of Afghanistan at Rawalpindi to keep the Emir from deserting to the Russians. Here's a Punch cartoon. Oops. His fear and loathing of the Ruskies was expressed again in 1890 in his story, The Man Who Was, about a British soldier of the White Hussars captured in the Crimean War, imprisoned by the Russians for 30 years before his escape, who crawls into his regimental mess in Peshawar on an evening when a visiting Russian officer is the regiment's guest of honor and remembers him as a captive. The same feeling is to be found in Kipling's poem of 1898, The Truce of the Bear, stressing the danger of thinking that the Russians ever accepted defeat on the northwest frontier. Quote, "There is no truce with Adamzad, the bear that looks like a man." It had not been put aside by 1936, the year he died. In his final will, drawn up 10 days before his death, he stipulated that no investment in Russian stocks should be made by the trustee of his estate. The best way to protect for Great Britain in the 1880s, the geopolitical rules of the Great Game were founded on a certain set of assumptions. First, India was too important to lose economically. Second, Britain's credibility as a great power could not have survived the subcontinent's loss. Third, the so-called jewel in the crown had become a part of the national identity. And finally, in an age of jostling empires, India acted as a crucial hub for all British possessions in the East and was the base for further expansion. This is the Boland Pass, the southern counterpart of the Khyber Pass, with British troops marching north in the First Anglo-Afghan War, which meant, of course, the Russians could march that way south. The best way to protect India against a Russian attack through Afghanistan, it was concluded by the British Foreign Ministry in the 1830s and onwards, was to keep Russia out of that country. The British strategy thereafter was to employ the decaying regimes of Islamic Asia as a gigantic buffer between British India and the threatening Russians, to stop them from establishing any sort of a presence on the dominating heights of the high mountain ranges in and adjoining Afghanistan. Through which those invaders could pour down to the plains of India. These are the various advances that the Russians might have taken. The Bolan Pass is at the bottom left. Understand, of course, Britain, conversely, had no desire to advance from India against Russia because whatever she took would be beyond the range of her sea power to hold. Now, there are not only one, but two ironies here. The first is that all the expeditions towards the Indian frontier which were contemplated by the Russians had as their purpose not invasion, as the British feared, but the inflaming of internal unrest, forcing Britain to increase the garrison and thereby reducing its power to defy Russia in Europe. If all this sounds rather familiar now, it's because the great game is still played, one of my themes here. The second irony, of course, is that after a century of defense policy, assuming that the attackers would be Russian and that they would come from the northwest, in World War II, the attackers turned out to be the Japanese, and they came from the east, through Burma. This is a map of the Russian territorial advances from 1825 to 1895, so we can understand why the British became increasingly skittish. In 1800, the frontiers between the Russian Empire and the British Empire were 2,000 miles apart. By 1876, that distance had been cut in half, and in the 2 decades between 1867 and 1888, Russia had acquired control of an additional 1,376,874 square miles in Central Asia. This is Lord Lytton, who was named Viceroy that year. The very naming of Queen Victoria as Empress in India, the Kaiser-i-Hind, had been part of Great Britain's grand strategy, announced before that Afghan war by Disraeli's hand-picked new Viceroy, Lord Lytton, in Delhi at the Imperial Assemblage. This is a photo of that. That Durbar featured a vivid firmament of uniforms variously worn by the 11th Hussars, the Bengal Lancers, the Bombay Cavalry, and all the troops of the 63 ruling chiefs, the kingdoms of the Maharajas, not absorbed yet, but by treaty, in a display of overwhelming military capability, a visible message to other European powers, but to Russia in particular, which might be counting on the instability of the Ottoman Empire to further their eastern spheres of influence. This is a painting of the Imperial Assemblage. Remarkably, the heraldic banners were designed by Kipling's father, while the 12-year-old Rudyard was being boarded in England. Furthermore, the great game sounded more equal if a Russian czar was opposed by an Indian empress. This is Queen Victoria on a throne presented by the Maharaja of Travancore. The Queen's new titles as Empress in both English and Hindustani were stamped on the gold and silver medals presented at the Imperial Assemblage to the attending individual dignitaries. In March 1898, while Kipling was writing Kim, a 23-year-old subaltern in the 4th Hussars on the northwest frontier published his first book, The Story of the Malacan Field Force. This subaltern, the not yet famous Winston Churchill, described the genesis of the newly evolving forward policy. Instead of depending on the, quote, line of the mountains, those images I showed you before of the natural defense, the, quote, purely defensive principle had to be modified in favor of punitive expeditions, close quote. He continued, as long as the border could remain a no man's land, as it were, quotes, Great Gulf fixed, close quotes, all was well. But, he continues, if any power was to be supreme, that power must be neither Russian nor Afghanistan. The predominance of Russian influence, he continues, in those territories would give them the power to invade India at their discretion, with what chances of success need not be discussed here, close quote. 3 years later in Kim is the very same pessimism. Kipling was less than sanguine about Britain's imperial future. Notably, the espionage action in Kim begins with the real-world outbreak of the Chitral Rebellion, which leads to Churchill's service in the Malakand Field Force. Kim's spymaster Mahbub Ali sends the first intelligence of the outbreak to his superior, Colonel Crichton, with Kim carrying the coded message. The phrase Great Game is said to have originated with a Bengal cavalry officer, here, Arthur Connolly, who came to believe that it was his personal mission to frustrate Russian schemes of conquest in Central Asia and to convince its independent Muslim rulers to band together to seek British protection. And he employed the phrase in 1838 in his Narrative of an Overland Journey to the North of India. The Russians had their own sporting metaphor for the contest. In 1837, Count Karly Velisevich Nesselrode, the Tsar's forest minister, called it Tournament of Shadows. This is the Panir Boundary Commission, and ironically, historians consider the effective end of the Great Game to have occurred before the publication of Kim at the signing on 10 September 1885 of the Pamir Boundary Commission protocols, when the border between Afghanistan and the Russian Empire was defined. After that, there was thought to be considerably less need for information about Russia in Central Asia. Kipling's novel, appearing fully 6 years later, revived the popularity of the term and introduced the new implication of great power rivalry. Kipling, of course, was hardly alone in using the metaphor of a game for spying or war. This had been nurtured by such poets as John Masefield and, pictured here, Sir John Henry Newbolt, whose Vitae Lampada, of 1898, a public school favorite, begins with the image of a school cricket match and ends with a depiction of boys at war, ending, the river of death has brimmed its banks, and England's far in honors and name, but a voice of the schoolboy rallies the ranks. Play up, and play the game. This talk's subject is not to review the manifold glories and confusions of Kim as a work of world literature, but rather to consider the hold that the author's protagonist was to cast on real spies and their government secret services in Great Britain and the United States, and on the novelists who wrote about those agencies. Still, one useful bit of literary criticism might be quoted here. In the words of Oxford academic J.I.M. Stewart, quote, it is the task of the courageous, the resourceful, and the bold to guard the frontier, to hold the wall. But this divided loyalty scarcely means that Kim has to make a choice. That choice has been made for him by the whole structure of the society which has brought him up. It is his destiny to play the great game. Cunning may enable him to obtain, within the rules of the game, a role in which he can serve and protect his llama still. But he is a servant and protector, not a disciple. Quote, it is too high for me, close quote, he says, when his master has preached his most impressive sermon, close quote. Playing one's role in the great game is Kipling's metaphor for living the heroic life, and the British Secret Service in India serves as a trope to suggest a brotherhood of those dedicated to the heroic life. Through Kipling's imagination, the real-life British Secret Service in India has been transformed into a sort of secret brotherhood to protect the people from the chaos and the evil that threatens from without. These brothers, of whom only one was also white or part white, are the spymaster, Colonel Crichton, this is as depicted by the actor Robert Douglas in the movie Kim. The Afghan horse trader Mahbub Ali, as sculpted in a bas-relief by Kipling's father for the novel. The Babu Hari Chunder Mukherjee, again by Lockwood Kipling. And the mysterious storekeeper and spy trainer in Simla, Lurgan Sahib, a modern image of him. Lurgan trains Kim in the powers of observation, making him look at a tray of jewels for a brief moment and then recite their descriptions from memory. This is something, by the way, that Lord Baden-Powell put into the Boy Scouts handbook as good training for future Boy Scouts. And Kim, in a moment of self-realization, takes to their spy master Crichton as, in Kipling's words, quote, a man after his own heart, a tortuous and indirect person playing a hidden game, close quote. Some critics have argued that Kim has not had to elect a career by the end of the novel. While technically right, Kim is mute after the Lama's final sermon, appealing to the boy to accompany him further despite having ended the Lama's quest for the hidden arrow. He can be reticent about the future for only so long, and it seems to me that Kim's silence betokens his entry into the great game. But this doubt as well ignores our hero's sudden blooding by experience in the field upon meeting two spies posing as hunters of wild goats, but bearing surveyors' chains and levels and compasses to enable them to measure incursion routes across the border. Contemplating the future joy of being a, quote, assistant chainman, close quote, for the novel's ethnographical survey, Kim is suddenly at age 17 in, quote, a damn tight place, thinking in English, compelled to attack and lame with a kick in the groin an adult stranger, the Russian spy who struck the Lama, and then bang his head against a boulder. Would I had killed him, says Kim, and then escape in a hail of gunfire from the revolver of the Russian's companion, the French spy. With Mahbub's fortuitously gifted .450 revolver, he returns fire, uncertainly, and, quote, as a player of the great game, he begins to reverence the Babu and quickly executes Hurry's battlefield order to find and rifle the foreign agents' saddlebags for evidence of their treachery with the tribal chieftains. The subsequent responsibility of hiding and bearing the, quote, oilskin packet of letters and the loaded books and diaries causes the youngster to break down. But at Kim's depression's end, he reflects on Hurry's quick thinking and continued peril in accompanying the spies to Simla, not having been revealed in his role, and they're together having engineered the, quote, collapse of their great game. Kim concludes in admiration, I must get into the world again. This is Hurry with the two spies from a French illustrated translation of Kim. Britain's leading historian of intelligence, Cambridge University's Christopher Andrew, has called Kim, quote, probably the finest of all spy novels, although it transcends the world of espionage. Of course, in the novel, ubiquitous agents of the British Raj play, quote, the great game that never ceases day or night throughout India, doing it with a subtlety quite beyond the capacity of Tsarist Russia, quote, the dread power of the North, and its French allies, whose emissaries are, quote, smitten helpless. Now, we have to remember, at the date of Kim's composition, it was the Franco-Russian alliance, which was regarded as the principal international threat to Britain in threatening a pincer movement. In truth, the British Army was the last in Europe to form a department of military intelligence. The Army in India lagged well behind, not creating an intelligence organization until 1879, comprised only of 3 officers, 3 native clerks, and a munshi, interpreter, and its sphere of responsibility, while including, of course, Central Asia, excluded territory already annexed by Russia, which was covered by the Intelligence Directorate in London, and Russia was included only in the section which dealt with Spain, Portugal, and Polynesia. From the 1860s, there was only one expert on Russia in the whole of Whitehall, attached indeed to the India Office, but only in 1876 was it recommended that his studies of Russia and his translations should be made available to the Foreign Office and the War Office. This is Kipling in his Vermont home in Brattleboro writing Kim. On the other hand, in Kim, which from internal evidence seems to occur in the years 1893 to 1898, Kipling describes an espionage network, quote, so large that one sees but a little at a time, close quote. The novel's numbering system for agents suggests as much. If there is a C-25, which is Kipling's code name for Mahbub Ali, there must be 24 other C's. And if there's an R-17, Kipling's code for the Babu Hari, surely 16 other R's. And if C's and R's, there must be D's through S's as well. Hannah Arendt called the book, quote, the foundation legend of the British Secret Service, quote, the legend of the great game as told by Rudyard Kipling in Kim. Mahbub Ali tells Kim, the game is so large that one sees but a little at a time. Historian Andrews observes that as far as the War Office was concerned, the myth of a far-flung intelligence network, whether promulgated by Kipling or a lesser literary talent like William Le Queux, whose England's Peril, a story of the Secret Service about a French spy master, was published in 1900, the year before Kim, had the incidental advantage of avoiding public revelation of Britain's intelligence weakness. The only conclusion, consolation, the War Office concluded, is that every foreign government implicitly believes that we already have a thoroughly organized and efficient European Secret Service, close quote. The work of both writers demonstrates that the powers chiefly suspected of designs on the bare throat of the empire were Britain's oldest enemy, France, across the narrow channel, and recently guilty of a frontal challenge at Fashoda, and her Russian ally, menacing India. In time, after the settling of broad Asian differences with Russia, with signing of the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, before which there was never a real battle or even an armed skirmish, the new threat for Great Britain became the alarming machinations of German intelligence. And in October 1909, the government created the Foreign Section of a new Secret Service Bureau. Within a year, these had given way to a Home Department responsible for counterespionage, the ancestor of MI5, and a Foreign Department in charge of overseas espionage, the forerunner of the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, or MI16, the home to fictional spies James Bond and George Smiley, and to the real agents and later spy novelists Somerset Maugham, Ian Fleming, Graham Greene, and John le Carré. And the fictional boy was mightily admired by living men who became real spies, not only Britons, but Americans, even to the point of assuming Kim's name. Of these, it's been fairly said by the intelligence historian Thomas Powers, they tended to be white Anglo-Saxon politicians from families with old money, at least in the beginning, and they somehow inherited traditional British attitudes toward the colored races of the world. Not the Pukka Sahib arrogance of the Indian Raj, but the fascination and condescension of men like T.E. Lawrence, who were enthusiastic partisans of alien cultures into which they dipped for a time and rarely doubted their ability to help until it was too late. This is Alan Dulles in Switzerland. He died in 1969, and he was the younger brother, as many of you may know, of Eisenhower's Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. After World War II service in Switzerland with the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, running an espionage network, he helped draft the legislation that created the Central Intelligence Agency and served as its deputy director, and then from 1953 to 1961, serving as its most important director in the CIA's first half-century. This is his CIA card, number 1A. For him, Kipling's great game was a renewed contest with Soviet Russia following the Second World War for control of the entire globe that Dulles pursued with a patriot's devotion, an appetite for combat, and an elastic sense of the permissible, in a Cold War that began on 17 May 1945 and lasted until the Berlin Wall came down on 9 November 1989. A Princeton graduate and a Presbyterian, he had early in his career spent a year teaching English in a mission school, an Indian mission school in Allahabad, where Kipling had once worked as a journalist. While there, Dulles attended meetings of the anti-colonial movement. He met Motilal Nehru and his son, Jawaharlal, the future prime minister, just back then from Cambridge University. Dulles first read Kim in 1914, sailing towards India to take up his teaching post, and he kept it with him his whole life. This well-worn copy was on his bedside table when he died. Later in his career, while a guest lecturer at Yale, Dulles, one of whose nicknames was the Great White Case Officer, acted Colonel Crichton, meeting with a large group of students interested in a career with the CIA, using the corporation room in Yale's headquarters building, Woodbridge Hall. This is Errol Flynn, who played Mahbub Ali, and the young Dean Stockwell in Kim. The movie adaptation, to which film rights were first acquired in 1923, had a rockier passage to production, and by the time the latest rights holder, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, was ready to proceed, World War II had begun, and the British had become a fraught subject in the rest of India. The U.S. Office of War Information banned the making of Kim and a reissue of Gunga Din, which had been released in 1939, because they, quote, might upset our prospective Indian allies. The new government of India gave permission to film there in 1947, and when Kim was finally filmed in Technicolor in 1951, with Dean Stockwell, as I said, as Kim and Errol Flynn as Mahbub Ali, the French and Russian spies of the novel were transformed into two Russians, reflecting the beginning of Cold War paranoia. This is Kermit Kim Roosevelt Jr., one of Dulles's favorite officers, Theodore Roosevelt's grandson. He died in 2000. He was a Harvard-educated Arabist and a Kipling devotee. His father, the first Kermit, as a 14-year-old in 1903, just 2 years after the book Kim's publication, accompanied President Roosevelt on a trip to the Badlands, where TR in 1884 had become friends with Sheriff Seth Bullock. Some of you may remember him as a character in this century's TV series, Deadwood. Bullock nicknamed the boy Kim because he reminded the lawman of the friendly boy in Kipling's novel. Kim thereafter became the standard nickname for all the Kermits in the Roosevelt clan. Kermit Roosevelt IV is called Kim and teaches at the University of Virginia Law School. Kermit Jr., this man was the editor of the OSS's official 2-volume history, and he moved with many of its officers directly into the CIA, joining its Office of Policy Coordination. In his book of 1949, Arabs, Oil, and History, he urged payback for Soviet expansion of minority discontents in the West by using Afghanistan as the springboard for sowing discord in Soviet Central Asia and the Russian Caucasus, the great game now being played by the USA. Assigned to Egypt, he aided in that country's army's move to carry out the Free Officers' coup d'etat in 1952, which installed Nasser, part of Roosevelt's strategic notion of America forming an alliance with Arab countries as they emerged from under the sway of Britain and France, as the Cold War gathered momentum. More notoriously, he was the architect of the CIA's successful effort in 1983 to overthrow Mossadegh, the Majlis-appointed leader of Iran, installing in his place Shah Reza Pahlavi, the consequences of which still poison Iranian-American relations. Dulles' tenure and his fascination with Kim cast a long shadow. When the British military historian John Keegan visited the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters at Langley in 1984, what impressed him most was its resemblance to British India's political and secret service in the days of the Raj. He wrote in this book, War Paths, "Vietnam was our Raj," one of the old field hands said to me. The CIA does indeed carry on the traditions of the Indian political service, the ethos of Kim and the Great Game. Mediation between the old power of the Anglo-Saxon world and the new is the CIA's calling. It has assumed the mantle once worn, Keegan concludes through this quotation of an officer, worn by Kim's masters as if it were a seamless garment. One final American intelligence officer is to be mentioned, Edward Lansdale, life and death dates 1908 to 1987. Here he is in the back with DM removing his cap. He's a former Air Force officer, a CIA operative, and another favored lieutenant of Dulles. He masterminded the defeat of the Huck Rebellion, the communist uprising in the Philippines, and he engineered the election of his friend Raymond Magsaysay as that country's president in the early 1950s. He was sent to Saigon in 1954, and he guided another neophyte leader on behalf of the CIA, Ngo Dinh Diem. Lansdale organized teams to carry out secret operations in North Vietnam, encouraged anti-communist Catholics to emigrate south, and scouted out possible leaders among the competing private armies and local strongmen of Saigon and its surroundings before settling on Diem. Uniting this complex portfolio in Lansdale's mind was the inspiring figure of Rudyard Kipling. He wrote in his memoir, In the Midst of Wars, Vietnam was so filled with the arcane that I used to advise Americans to read Kipling's Kim and pay heed to the description of young Kimball O'Hara's counterintelligence training in the awareness of illusions. Close quote. Lurgan Sahib's Game of Jewels of 1901 was now used to train American operatives performing Lansdale's deception operations in North Vietnam. The two figures whose novels about spies did not make them spy novelists, but whose influence created the anxiety against which later thriller writers labored, were Rudyard Kipling and Joseph Conrad. The heroic romance of adventure of spying in the defense of empire comes from Kipling's Kim in 1901, and the cynical, realistic story of intrigue, betrayal, and double agents was established by Conrad's The Secret Agent in 1907. The game is central to the thriller. The Great Game, Kipling's term for the Secret Service in Kim, fitted the boy's fantasy of living between two cultures, English and Indian, a sort of double agent without the anxiety of the Cold War, but it also stuck as a term for espionage in succeeding thrillers. Kipling's younger contemporary and a servant of the empire was John Buchan. He died in office as Governor General of Canada in 1940, but he's been called, quote, the father of the modern spy thriller, whose books are about the penetration of the enemy, about lonely escape and wild journeys, about the thin veneer that stands between civilization and barbarism, even in the most elegant drawing room in London, close quote. Working over Kipling as one of a stable of authors in Britain's World War I Propaganda Bureau, serving as its director of information, Buchan was a fellow member of Kipling's London dining clubs, and they shared the same literary agent. In Buchan's series of thrillers, he developed one Kim-like hero, Sandy Arbuthnot, an accomplished linguist and a master of disguise. After The 39 Steps in 1915, Buchan's second most well-known thriller is Greenmantle in 1960, which indeed was his best-selling book. It features both Richard Hannay of the first novel and Sandy Arbuthnot, who goes east as a dancing dervish, like Daniel Dravitt's disguise in Leaving for Kafiristan in Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King. Describing Arbuthnot, Hannay reflects smugly, "We call ourselves insular, but the truth is that we, insert English, are the only race on earth that can produce men capable of getting inside the skin of remote peoples." Close quote. In Kim, the teenager is disguised by a prostitute, quote, dabbing a twist of cloth into a little saucer of brown dye that holds longer than walnut juice, close quote. Greenmantle, in which Germany makes use of a Muslim prophet to destroy India's empire, is in some sense Buchan's Kim. A new and more sinister Great Game commenced with the beginning of World War I in 1914, masterminded in Berlin, but unleashed from Constantinople. This took the form of a holy war against Britain and the Russians in Central Asia, fought out between the intelligence services of the king, the Kaiser, the Sultan, and the Tsar. Buchan was then closely involved in intelligence work and had recently had ready access to the secret reports of German activity in the East. This is a painting of Barik Khan, who was a real Afghan horse dealer, by Rudolf Swoboda, who was an Austrian painter who met the Kiplings in India. In Greenmantle, Sir Walter Bullivant, permanent secretary to the Foreign Office and employer of secret agents, briefs Richard Hannay, with whom he worked in the 39 Steps, and echoes the old subcontinental contest and Kipling's Afghan horse trader Mahbub Ali. Hard to miss. Quote, "It is a great game, and you are the man for it, no doubt. I have reports from agents everywhere, peddlers in South Africa, Afghan horse dealers, Turkoman merchants, pilgrims on the road to Mecca, as well as respectable consuls who use ciphers. They tell the same story. The East is waiting for a revelation. Some star is coming out of the West. The Germans know, and that is the card with which they are going to astonish the world." The premier historian of this conflict in the First World War, Peter Hopkirk, notes that the German strategy of a drive to the east, the Drang nach Osten, took in the whole of British India and Burma, with the aid of smuggled arms, funds, and crates of revolutionary literature smuggled into India behind the innocuous dust wrappers of English classics. Berlin hoped to foment violent revolutionary uprisings among the restive natives, whether Muslims, Sikhs, or Hindus, the very insurrectionist aim of that foiled by Hari and Kim 4 decades in fictional time before. Another favorite author of Alan Dulles was Ian Fleming, here pictured with, of course, the quintessential James Bond, Sean Connery. Dulles politically wooed Jack Kennedy by sending copies of new Bond novels as soon as he got his hands on them to the senator and his wife. And Jackie Kennedy had given Dulles From Russia with Love in the first place. Fleming, passed away in 1964, never announced an affection for Kipling. Nevertheless, in his creation of the greatest code name ever for the modern spy, 007, he was almost certainly channeling Kipling's use of a masking number for the secret agent. Lurgan Sahib, in first speaking of the Bengali Babu, tells Kim, quote, "He has no name, but only a number and a letter. That is the custom among us." The origins of the 00 title may date to Fleming's wartime service. Agents of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, were given, in real life in history, an O prefix when they became 0 rated upon completion of training in how to kill. Bond's 00 number was awarded to him because he twice killed in fulfilling assignments. First of the series, Casino Royale, the 00 concept is introduced. In the second, Live and Let Die, the 00 number designates a past killing, and not until the third, Moonraker, does the 00 number designate a license to kill. We're a long way away from Agent R-17, the obese Babu, under Mukherjee. But the use of a code name by Fleming seems clearly derived from Kipling and Kim, because survey work undertaken by the pundits, the Indian names, for the real surveyors working on surveys for the Raj, they could extend up to and beyond the frontier, their lives might be in danger, and secrecy was necessary. Thus, the original pundits in history were known by code names such as the Mullah, the Mirza, and the Munshi. When their leader, Captain T.G. Montgomery, began publishing their reports in the Royal Geographical Society Journal, code names were employed, often simply initials or numbers. Number 1, the Patwar or GM, and the third pundit or GK. Kipling borrowed the idea of code names from the journal accounts. In Kim, Mahbub Ali is C25-1B, the Babu Hari is R17, and the Maratha, whom Kim helps to disguise, is E23. In the novel, Kim wishes that he could, quote, enjoy the dignity of a letter and a number and a price upon his head. The greatest spy novelist of the 20th century, and into our own, who passed away only recently in 2020, was a veteran of both MI5 and MI6 who depicted their characteristics in a fictional circus. He was more interested in internal treachery within the Secret Service or between rival nations' services, a ruthless, impersonal, cerebral contest, than in greater border contentions abroad. Nevertheless, he was fascinated with Kim and hated Fleming's Bond, whom he called the ultimate prostitute and the ideal defector. As one literary critic has observed, quote, references, muting and ironic, are frequent within the novels of the circus, close quote. Like Kipling's, Le Carre's fictive imagination was inspired by contemporary history. His principal villains, Bill Hayden of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Magnus Kim of A Perfect Spy, are both partly based on the notorious British traitor and KGB double agent Harold Adrian Russell Kim Philby. Notably, Le Carre's charming adult spy, Magnus Pym of A Perfect Spy, has a last name that rhymes with the teenage Kims, and to be the perfect spy is to deceive even oneself with the sincerity of one's play acting. Indeed, Kim Philby might be said to have been constructed along the lines of Kipling's teenage hero. He was born in 1922 in Ambala, in the Punjab, one of the fictitious Kim's haunts, of British parentage, and earned his nickname for his baby fluency in Punjabi. Years later in Moscow, after resigning from M16 under suspicion in 1951, and then fleeing to Russia after belated exposure of one of the Cambridge Five with Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, Philby explained, quote, I spent more time with the servants and other Indians than I did with my own parents, so I soon picked up some words in Punjabi. One day my father came into the kitchen and heard me chattering away. Good heavens, he said, he's a real little Kim. Everyone began calling me Kim, and the name struck. Close quote. This is Henry St. John Philby and the young Kim Philby. But what Kim Philby wrote was too simple an explanation. His father, St. John Philby, 1885 to 1960, later famous for his career in the Middle East, was a self-dramatizing Indian civil service officer who first worked and lived in the Punjab in Lahore, where Kim is set. He gave the boy his nickname at age 2 in 1914, and in the words of the pair's dual biographer, quote, the name touched the British heart. It meant something in the Raj and other official classes, the young man on duty on the frontiers of empire, the subaltern working for the common good, that of the Occident and the Orient, in the foothills of the Himalayas. It had something imperial and admiral about it. No other name of the period had such resonance, for it bespoke romance and adventure in distant parts. Close quote. Philby's chief in MI6 was Sir Stuart Menzies, known as C, that's transmuted to M, in Fleming's Bond novels. In a reminiscence published in the Times at Menzies' death, an Eton schoolmate recollected that their housemaster at that school, Edward Impey, quote, had a profound love and admiration for the works of Kipling and Co. and Kim. Had the book played its part in Philby's appointment to the Secret Service? Close quote. But when Russian cables from 1945 were decoded in their frantic search for the Cambridge Spies' third man, Philby's codename was jarringly Stanley. This is Philby's news conference denying being the third man. He was to flee 2 years later. According to Le Carre's extended analysis of Kim Philby and his father, quote, he could hardly fall when his father delivered him over to the establishment, hardly fail when his father delivered him over to the establishment for his education, to feel already that he was being trained in the enemy camp. Like Kipling's boy, one feels, he was already waiting for the call. Quote, it was intrigue, of course. He knew that much. He had known all evil since he could speak. But what he loved was the game for its own sake, the stealthy prowl through the dark gullies and lanes. Close quote. Le Carre does not reveal here that he's quoting from Kim itself. The boy delighted, wrote Kipling, in the stealthy prowl through the dark gullies and lanes, the crawl up a water pipe, and the headlong flight from housetop to housetop under cover of the hot dark. Close quote. So not only is Philby a model for the traitor Bill Hayden in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, but in that novel, retired MI6 agent turned preparatory school teacher Jim Prideaux reads Buchan to the boys in their dormitory and uses little Bill Roach to spy for him, like Mahbub Ali uses Kim, giving the boy purpose because he's a, quote, good watcher, who by his watchfulness helps protect Prideaux from strangers on the school grounds, as Kim saves Mahbub Ali from his own would-be assassins. Le Carré's Our Game, published in 1995, in its title alone invoked the great game of Kim. This story is about a former British intelligence operative, now a university professor, and his own former MI6 handler, now a retired treasury boffin. By the end, both Britons end up with AK-47s joining the rebels in Ingushetia in the Caucasus to fight the Russians. Kipling's reference and influence, too, is to be found in Le Carré's The Secret Pilgrim from 1990, a group of linked short stories. His provisional title for this book was Plain Tales from the Circus, an allusion to Kipling's Plain Tales from the Hills from 1888. Now, as we've seen, the organized spy service of the Great Game is almost entirely Kipling's invention. There was no intelligence service nor an ethnographical department. There was only a governmental task force called Survey of India that was entrusted with the task of charting all India. In this sense, Kipling's ethnographical department is as invented as Le Carré's The Circus. Kim is not, in the end, about the glory of the British Empire, but about the wonder of the human spirit of heroism. In her Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt observed, quote, playing the great game, a man may feel as though he lives the only life worthwhile because he's been stripped of everything which may still be considered accessory. Life itself seems to be left in a fantastically intensified purity when man has cut himself from all social ties, family, regular habits, occupation, a definite goal, ambitions, and a guarded place in the community to which he belongs by birth, close quote. Barnaby Dubray, one of Kipling's most perceptive critics, put it differently. Man is playing a great game of to be or not to be in the face of an indifferent universe. Mahbub Ali also tells Colonel Crichton of the boy, when he comes to the great game, he must go alone, alone and at the peril of his head. Then, if he spits or sneezes or sits down other than as the people do whom he watches, he may be slain. Close quote. In the next chapter, Kim tells Mahbub Ali, I see my road all clear before me in a good service. Kim seems to perceive that he's being initiated into a select, elite, and secret society for whom unselfish service to others, even in the face of death, is paramount, spying not for patriotism or to practice violence or for pay. The pay, he declares, is the least of the work. He's been prepared by his instructors to embody the intellectual strength and moral standing to handle truths that are above other people, be they practical or spiritual. In his Grand Strategies, Literature, Statecraft, and the World Order, the late former diplomat and Yale historian Charles Hill writes about Kipling's great game. It is a game, but deadly serious as well, a Hobbesian war of all against all, epitomized when Russian and French agents viciously beat up the Lama. The empire must be protected by espionage in the first instance, by war, if it comes to that. Close quote. A game is finally simply a game, and no matter how seriously the great game may be taken by the players, an adult will always know the ultimate inconclusiveness, if not futility, the frequent loss, if not the tragedy, of such an enterprise. In 1901, Kipling wrote, when everyone is dead, the great game is finished, not before. In 1967, Ian Fleming wrote in The Spy Who Loved Me, it's nothing but a complicated game. But then, so's international politics, diplomacy, all the trappings of nationalism and the power complex that goes on between countries. Nobody will stop playing the game. It's the appeal of spy novels today to their readers and to spies. I will conclude with a sobering reflection of one of our greatest modern military historians, whom I've quoted before, John Keegan, written 2 years after 9/11, about the urgent need of modern espionage services to combat foreign terrorist cells. Quote, "The challenge will cast the agencies back into the methods which have come to appear outdated, even primitive, in the age of satellite surveillance and computer decryption. Kipling's Kim, who has survived in modern times only as the delightful literary creation of a master novelist, may come to provide a model of the anti-fundamentalist agent, with his ability to shed European identity and to pass convincingly as a Muslim message carrier, a Hindu gallant, and a Buddhist holy man's hanger-on, far superior to any holder of a PhD in higher mathematics." Given what happened last August with our misaimed drone strike during the withdrawal from the Kabul airport, that appraisal now seems prophetic. Thank you.
I think we have a little bit of time for some further questions. To start us off, if you don't mind, I have two.
Two? You're an ex-president. Yes, please, go ahead.
The first one is, I wonder if you would share some further personal comments on how you arrived to Kipling in your lifelong literary voyage. And second of all, what's it like to be head of the Kipling Society? Thank you.
I'll answer the second one first. It completely astonished me that they invited me to be president. It's a better job than being president of the Grolier because I have no term limits. I only have one duty, is to open the annual general meeting, and I'm sure that when the Queen recovers from COVID, I will get my gong. Okay? So that's the answer to that one. Well, some of you know how I came to do this. Bruce mentioned I was a retired real estate lawyer. And you may remember the crash in 2008, but the one that sticks in my mind is the one in 1998, 1999, when the savings and loan went bust. And I had 2 partners and 6 associates in my law firm. And 18 months later, I had 1 partner and 1 associate. And I thought it was my fault. I thought I'd made the wave come in, and therefore if the wave went back out, it must be my fault. And I watched my department collapse. And whatever the line is between little d, I feel bad depression into clinical depression is what happened. And I was hospitalized for 3 weeks in Silver Hill up in Connecticut, mostly with ESPN sports producers who were there for other problems, not like this confused white man with a business problem. And so when I came out, my Scarsdale shrink suggested to get me back up on the bike that I used to do. I'd do again what I used to like to do. And I said I collected books, won a prize at Yale as a sophomore, and he said, do that again. So I told him I would, so he'd stop poking me, as you do with shrinks. And I started with World War I poets, because I did American Studies at Yale, and I read modern history with concentration on Europe after 1870 and the Second British Empire after they lost us, India, going forward. And but I started with Sassoon and Graves and Owen, and I discovered Bill Reese had already done all the Sassoon and most of the Graves, and Owen's only 6 books, and then he dies. So your Owen collection is quick and short. And then I realized, to come to the point, that with Kipling I could get both the Raj and World War I. He lost his son. They never found the body. He died at the Battle of Loos and got buried in the mud. The Queen Mother's brother died in that battle. The late Queen Mother Elizabeth's brother died in that battle. It broke Kipling's heart. He wrote a 2-volume history of the Irish Guards and told his secretary it was his greatest work, which none of you have ever heard of. The other great thing, of course, was Kipling was relatively cheap. It's not buying Great Gatsby in a dust jacket or Hemingway in a dust jacket. I could get A. Edward Newton's copy of Captains Courageous with Newton's bookplate and a dust jacket for $3,000, not 30 or 40. It's like buying master drawings instead of paintings, as it were. And I could go on eBay every night, every Friday night, and I still do it. And I now have 2,500 things at Yale. And I know none of you ever go outside the coloring lines on books and do things like stamps and manuscripts and bookmarks, and well, I did. And Yale took them all, God bless them, because when you can't immediately get your fix with a book or a manuscript, you see something else that's kind of fun. And I convinced myself that it was, part of the whole show. But that's how I started this, and am still playing that collecting game all these years later. And I believe I will also say I started the bibliography out of my computer catalog, and I knew I could quit and no one would criticize me. And I might still have been a little vulnerable. And then eventually I showed somebody the computer catalog, and Oak Knoll suggested I do a bibliography, and then got wobbly and went to the British Library to cut their losses. And so I ended up co-publication, and the way I pay them back is I quote the British Library before Oak Knoll now when I describe the book. But that all came out of that, and I spent 12 years writing the bibliography down in the basement after my wife and kids were asleep. But it was not work. It was nobody was making me do it. I could stop at any time, and I think it healed me. And now I've become the greatest bore on earth with that. And I'm proud of it. Okay, let's not be confused. Are there any other questions after that? Yes, sir.
Yes. Do you see literature and spycraft as a kind of a feedback mechanism where the literature testifies to spycraft, the spycraft spurs the literature?
Oh, absolutely. And it's true.
The second part of that is, therefore, if there were no literature, would spycraft kind of fizzle off into the doldrums?
Well, many people, particularly in the 20s and 30s and the popularity of Agatha Christie, I have at home a great bibliography or biographies of mystery writers from the golden era, Isles and Christie and all of those. But I think the spy novel, from Conrad on, if not from Kipling on, feeds into our 20th century fears with these cataclysmic wars, and God help us, we trying to avoid a third one of those. And it's intriguing to me how this administration, against the Russians' own word and every other spy service, predicted that this was going to happen. Said how many troops there were, said they were going to do. Russia said no. Russia's diplomat says wars don't start on Thursday. Happened to be a Tuesday, I think, but it happened. And so we're in a bit of a conundrum right now, and the Ukrainians are paying for it. But this sort of great power, the McAnder notion that whoever controls Europe controls the landmass, is now being quoted by analysts, and he was bringing from not only the European wars, but what had happened in Asia. And now we're in a situation which, to my mind, I used this in a Zoom I was on this morning. Think of World War I. You've got Germany, that's China. Think of Russia, that's Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary wants to punish the Serbs. Germans give them a blank check. World War I. I don't think anybody believes Russia's going to come out of this. China's the big winner now. And history doesn't repeat itself, but there's definitely a rhyme in my head there. But the anxiety of living in such times, and all of us, many of us were old enough to do the duck under our desks back in elementary school. And suddenly we're talking about it again, and we thought, we'd missed the bullet or the missile, as it were, back in '63. And here we are again. And it is intelligence which may help save us here, but we have to see. But I do think that spy novels and that kind of thriller almost has replaced mysteries, and I think that has something to do with our 21st century, late 20th century psyche, the cozy Agatha Christie sort of mystery. While mysteries are still popular, the thrillers, I think, have taken them over of various quality, just like mysteries. But it's a way of working through our anxieties, I think. Stephen.
What was it before World War I poets? And you were at Yale when you decided to write books, is that?
Oh, well, I was going to go back and run for Congress from San Bernardino County, except I decided there were too many Mormons there, and I wasn't, and I couldn't get voted in. But I had a collection of American presidents, and some of them, yeah, you could go down to Fourth Avenue, and I could buy Calvin Coolidge's autobiography for $1 signed, and you didn't have to spend a lot of money to win the prize at Yale. The pudding had to have a theme, and you were interviewed. So, what is the theme of your collection? And mine was American presidents, and I was an American Studies major, and then I first got exposed to the Raj in World War I over reading modern history at Cambridge, and so I spend more of my time writing about that now, or thinking about that now.
You still have those books?
Sorry? Eric?
You went from presidents, and it's from Reese that you bought you were in Yale, right?
Right, and Bill liked to remind me he won the prize twice, and I'd only won it once. Bill had resources I didn't have at that age, but I'm his successor as president of the Library Associates, and I love the man and I honor him. But my historical interests expanded, and I'm now helping David Blight because Yale has a commission on slavery, and I've gotten back into Yale history and slavery history, particularly the 19th century where we have some good things. The 18th century is going to be god-awful. Jonathan Edwards had a little slave. So did Ezra Stiles. 3 of the 10 Yale ministers had Indian or black slaves behind them when they carried the 40 folios to Branford. It's going to be awful. But there are some good stories in the 19th century, and I'm writing them up for him. So I've been re-immersed in American history recently, but Kipling remains my main love. Thank you. Harry?
Yeah, this has been a fascinating tour of Kim's legacy here in spycraft, especially the romantic part. But when you look at the succession of romantic spy events, which you guided us through also, it comes up with Mossadegh and overthrowing Iran, or the mischief with Nasser, or Lansdale's.
Or DM, whom we had assassinated after Lansdale put him in place. Yes.
They all seem so unhappy, and it's almost as though the history of romantic spying is a history of failures rather than successes. There have been successes, like you mentioned.
No, I agree.
About Ukraine.
The spy masters will tell us we don't hear about the successes. We know about the stars in the CIA, but geopolitics sometimes ends badly, often ends badly. That's what makes newspapers, unfortunately. Eric?
Do you still have the president's collection?
No. I sold it to the Ohio book dealer whose name escapes me, but who sold those. He's now expanded and shows up at the shows and does literature as well, but I don't remember his name. But after putting together and moving it 6 times, I finally offloaded it at less than my acquisition cost, I suspect.
Did Kipling have an actual model for Kim, or a composite, or was it very much his imagination?
Scholars have tried to do that, and Peter Hopkirk, who wrote that book, The Great Game, which was straight history, wrote a book called The Quest for Kim. and traveled all through India trying to find models. For the Babu, there are a couple of models who are known historical figures. I think one's more likely than the other. And Lurgan Sahib was modeled on a trader in Simla. A 3-hour version of this talk has pictures of his store, but he was a real person. Eventually ended up and traded in jewels and ended up going bankrupt. So there were certainly some models. No model particularly for Colonel Crichton, and no model for the little boy himself. And the thing that most people know about it is the journey with the Lama and Teshu. And it was King Kipling's father who gave him all that kind of information about that thing. But as I said, for a long time, from his parents writing to him at school until the end of his life, he had that twitchy nervousness about the Russians. And if you know any of his poems besides Gunga Din, Recessional, of course, is a prayer that the British not be too proud of where their empire is. That's 1898. And then he loses his son in the war and was bitter about the way the South African War, from which he reported for 10 days, ended. And he joined for a while. I've done an article on that too, with Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes in one Sherlock Holmes story, The Noble Bachelor, and Cecil Rhodes in arguing between 1890 and 1898 for the reunion of the British Empire. Forget that little kerfuffle in 1776 where King George screwed it up. And let's get together. Andrew Carnegie sewed together a Union Jack and an American flag and flew it above his Scottish castle as part of the same movement. And the notion was we should get together. Rhodes scholars were going to be part of this. We're going to be Jesuits. Get the Americans over, get the colonials over, train them to be leaders, train them to be presidents, like a Clinton or a Bob Steele in Australia. And then everything changed. The Russia-France thing changed in 1902, and that all disappeared. But British anxiety was not just about India, but Arthur Conan Doyle's novel, The White Company. The dedication is to the reunion of the British Empire. And would Britain, when threatened, would its peoples, would its dominions help it? Would its colonies help it? They became dominions. And of course, in World War I, King George declared everybody was, in the fight. That wasn't the case in World War II. They had to make their own choices. But Kim is just to conclude, a heroic story, not historically accurate, about how a defeat occurred in the Great Game. But Kipling was dealing with part of his anxiety, and he gave it a happy ending. World War I was not a happy ending. Yes, Steve?
I hope this isn't going to be a too long reply, but what connection do you see between Mowgli, who was conceived in Vermont, and Kim, who you say was conceived in Vermont? Young man, Rudyard, young boy, alone in the company of his companions, and then you have.
Well, you can certainly make parallels, and the Jungle Books are more clearly aimed at children. You can draw adult novels from them, that they're aimed at younger people, and it was so successful he did a second Jungle Book. The fact that they both have young protagonists is, I think, more evidence simply that he was very good at describing and writing for and speaking to children, just so stories being the greatest part. We'll conclude with that.